Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel on multipolarity and the new realities of global politics, Turkey as a stabilizing power. Today we will discuss the international system, the rapidly evolving international system, that many people started to use the word uncertainty a lot. In the recent conferences, meetings, forums, we started to see that uncertainty become one of the most frequently used words one more time. It reminded many people the early 1990s, the books that were written early 1990s, that as a result of the end of the Cold War, many people were talking about the uncertainty, the questions about the future. Most of the articles were basically ending with a question mark. So we are now at one of those periods. There are so many different dynamics taking place. One of those panels actually that will take place tomorrow is about the return of geopolitics and the superpower rivalry. The war in Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine war, basically changed many dynamics. The fact that there are so many uncertainties about post-COVID world, changing supply chains, changing economic dynamics around the world, whether the trade war will continue or not, whether we will see another hot conflict in Asia-Pacific or not. There are so many questions right now, and experts on international relations are discussing whether these dynamics will bring a new phase, a new Cold War, or in another hot war, or what will happen to the global politics from now on. So today we will, with 5 distinguished panelists, we will discuss the main issues and Turkey's role in these issue areas. And I don't want to lose time by introducing our distinguished panelists one by one because it is already on the agenda. So I will just start with Yevgenia. We will have 5 minutes for each panelist for the introductory remarks. Then I will have a set of questions for each panelist, and we will try to have an interactive conversation. Yevgenia, let's start with you.
Thank you, and first of all, I would like to start from the words of appreciation to Turkey as a hosting country to the TRT forum for the invitation, and I do believe it's important to talk about Ukraine, Turkey, Black Sea regional security, because this is something which is at the core and will remain in the core of the European security and basically global security for many years to come. I won't have long remarks. I would just probably say that when we're talking about uncertainties, and we have a lot of uncertainties around us, there are some things which are certain and which remain unchanged. One of the things is that starting from the 1990s, we have the same aggressive policies of the Russian Federation, which has been quite unchangeable and persistent and consistent in that, starting from the conflicts of the 1990s, from the Karabakh and then Transnistria and then Georgia and then Ukraine, both occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea and the eastern regions of Ukraine, and now the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And of course we can add Syria to the picture and other regional conflicts to which Russia is a part. So I think one certain thing here is that unfortunately, Russia and current Russian regime cannot be trusted, and any agreements with the current regime cannot be kept by the Russian side. And it's not only about Ukraine, it's about many countries, including Turkey. If we look at the north of Syria, for example, Russia has never ever lived up to the expectations and actually implemented what it promised. Its words were not kept, its commitments were not kept, and this is something the Turkish foreign minister is also talking about. And the same is about Ukraine. So every time when we have talks about talks and peace negotiations and going back to the same table with the Russian side, and we appreciate Turkey's role here a lot. So I think from the Ukrainian side, we've been clear that we do appreciate Turkey's role here. The question that I have is not about Ukraine or Turkey, it's about Russia. And what are we expecting from Russia, which is shelling Ukrainian cities, civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and at the same time tries to have kind of these talks. And I come from Odessa, so it's nice to be here having light, heat, because we don't have that, internet, anything in the city which is not even under occupation. Second thing which is very certain and clear, I think, is that Ukraine and Turkey are natural partners and play a key role for the stability and security in the Black Sea region. And I think this is something we have to discuss now, because again, let me be very clear. In Ukraine, we appreciate the fact that from the first days of this war, Turkey closed the straits for the Russian warships. But on the other hand, let's be more ambitious and let's talk about the restoration of the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. And I think for the future, if we look into the future, this is up to Turkey, Ukraine, and our international partners to secure the maritime security and the freedom of navigation here. The same goes for the grain deal. We appreciate a lot Turkey's efforts and the efforts of the United Nations, but on the other hand, we have to understand that this comes at a very high price on Ukrainian side as well. So today, when President Erdogan was talking about how much it takes to have one piece of grain and to grow a wheat, we know that. You know that in Turkey, people in the global south, in African, Middle Eastern countries know, and Ukrainians know that, because it also takes hundreds of Ukrainian lives to be sowing the seeds and then to be gathering the crops under missiles and drones and mines in the battlefield. So it's not only about transportation of grain, which is important, it's also about the conditions that we have in Ukraine, which prevents us from providing food security and helping other nations which are at need. Last point here again, we're talking about, for example, supplies of the Turkish drones to Ukraine. But before this war, we had been talking about defense industry alliance between Ukraine and Turkey. And hopefully we'll get back to those discussions, because this is again the core of the Black Sea security for the future. So my main, probably one thing that I would like our audience to take away from this discussion today is that now we're dealing with the consequences, which are multiple crises, consequences of the Russian aggression, which are humanitarian crisis, food crisis, refugee crisis, energy crisis, inflation crisis, which are global. And we do appreciate Turkey's role here, which is of course constructive. But I would rather call on international community and Turkey as Ukraine's strategic partner to cooperate on dealing with the root cause of that, which is Russian aggression. And we have to cooperate more to deter Russia and to be sure that in the future, when Ukraine wins this war with the help of Turkey and our international partners, we will have stability and security in the region, and no country, including Russia and other players, would be able to violate international law and to get away with that as if nothing has happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evgenia. Brenda, floor is yours.
So it's great to be in Turkey, especially in Istanbul. See old friends discussing important issues. So some of the biggest geopolitical threats right now in the international system, Turkey will have the decisive role, whether that's Russia, Iran, China, and energy. And it's not just because of Turkey's location. People always talk about the geopolitical location. Of course, it's very relevant. But Turkey also is one of the only really powerful militaries in the region. Turkey also has the will to, there are many powers, but also has the will to take part and to ensure the security of other countries in the region and the general Black Sea, Caspian region, even Central Asia. And Turkey is the only, really one of the only countries that not only could be a deterrent, whether it's to Russia or to Iran, but also could be a bridge when those times when it's important to have that dialogue and to have that bridge. A couple things, on the context of Russia and Ukraine, I think again is presented it in an excellent way. I don't know how many of you are noticing how how much Turkey's influence is actually is very important in the current developments in Iran right now. As many of you may know, a third of the population of Iran is ethnic Turks. They watch TRT, they watch Turkish television more than they watch Iranian television or any other foreign television. They listen to Turkish, whether it's cultural elites, political elites, they have huge influence. And so what your country is doing now has huge influence on what's happening now in Iran. It's really unbelievable that we're a neighboring state to Turkey, that there's really dozens of young people getting murdered by the regime, on a weekly basis, executions, and again, the majority of these are actually Azerbaijani Turks, Qashqai Turks, Turkmen. It's unbelievable how that's kind of an exceptional role. Another thing that Turkey's been very influential in is the establishment of the Zengezur corridor. This will open a new route and reinforce a route from Turkey all the way to China for trade. And Turkey's role is pivotal in the establishment of this Zengezur corridor together with Azerbaijan, hoping to bring in Armenia and Russia, also that there will be understanding that this corridor benefits everyone in the region, but this could have a very good also economic impact for Turkey. Turkey is one of the only countries that's standing up for the territorial integrity of Muslims too, and not just European states. So I'm very happy, and I really don't mean this in a sarcastic way, that the world sees there's an important principle of standing up for the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and doesn't start to nitpick and say, oh, but these are ethnic Russians or these are ethnic this. No, there's an important principle that we run the world, and I think that same principle of territorial integrity applies to Muslims, such as Azerbaijan, and Turkey's shown that it's willing on almost every level to stand up for the ability of Azerbaijan to reassert its territorial integrity, and that's been a huge Turkey's contributed to a huge success for regional security, and even for something that I think is very important to Turks, which is for justice. I recently visited Zengilan region. It was under Armenian occupation for almost 27 years. I visited refugees that have gone back to their homes, people that had lived in tents, lived in schools, railroad cars, and now, thanks to the support of Turkey, thanks to the government of Azerbaijan, they're back in their homes. I honestly get chills when I think about it, with all the bad news we hear in the world, that actually you could see refugees go back and that and have a third generation of children that weren't born as refugees, being born in this region in Zengilan, and Turkey should feel very good about its contribution to that restoration of justice. As I pointed out, Iranian domestic situation, Turkey's, again, even through things like media like TRT, Turkey's having a huge effect on developments there. And last, I would say in the energy crisis, which we'll talk a little bit more in a panel in the afternoon, Turkey, by actually having, maybe not always listening to Europe, and having a strong state role and having very diversified energy systems, and having mostly pipeline gas, which is much more cheaper and more reliable than LNG, the way that Europe thought they don't need pipeline gas anymore. They can just lock into the LNG world. Turkey's actually set a very good example of how to have energy security and not to be so vulnerable to global price trends. And so I think Europe also can learn a lot from Turkey in this current energy crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will have questions on that in our second round. Matt.
Thanks, Kilic. Thanks also organizers for the honor of being here to have a chance to share some thoughts with friends of old and friends of new. When I was preparing, I reflected pretty literally on the title of this session, which I don't think is up there. Oh, no, that's okay. To paraphrase, it's is the world more multipolar, and is Turkey a stabilizing player? So the answer to both of those is yes. So thank you for, no, I'm not trying. I think that whoever it was on the fantastic team of TRT World Forum, when they came up with that headline or that subject for this session, we're thinking that people in the United States don't recognize that the world is multipolar. And maybe we need less of America first and more of the world is bigger than five, and it's time for the U.S. to wake up and work with its allies more. From my perspective, we've known the world is multipolar for my entire cognizant lifetime. I went to college, dating myself. I began in 1982, and by then, the landmark book on interdependence by Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye was already a decade old. And so those of us who studied during that general period international relations in the United States proceeded from an understanding that we are interdependent. The U.S. cannot do whatever it wants in the globe alone. We need allies. Sometimes we've forgotten that. So I served in the Bush administration in the White House for 4 years during 9/11 and the Iraq War. And during that period, I think my superiors and all of us forgot about how interdependent the world is. And the big criticism of the Bush administration's foreign policy was that we were going it alone and pursuing alliances of convenience and not pursuing a foreign policy that is based on coordination with allies. So that was the first 4 years of the Bush administration. My point here is that in the United States, we wax and wane at the highest level decision-making between knowing the world is multipolar and then forgetting about it for a little while. So during that period when we were going to go forward in Iraq no matter what, I was riding with a very senior U.S. official in a car, and that person said, "I'm sick and tired of this debate about multipolarity. Come on, this is enough of this. This is just political." And that person essentially was saying, I keep saying that person, it was a she. That person was not wanting for the moment to accept the reality of how the world is multipolar, and the U.S. can't just go ahead and succeed in invading another country if it's not doing it with its allies. We can invade. We did succeed in defeating Saddam Hussein's military quickly, but we were totally unprepared for the next phase of rebuilding the country and rebuilding the economy. And I will never forget how, at the time I was covering Turkey among other countries, the Turkish General Staff sent their counterparts in Washington a list of 230, 240 questions, Colonel Utzon may remember it, that were basically, each question was, what are you going to do after the military victory? Have you thought things through? Clearly you haven't, so maybe you don't want to invade and break everything, and then we, Turkey, are going to be left here to deal with the consequences because we can't change our geography. That message was lost on Washington. Obviously the war proceeded, and the cleanup phase was a disaster. So we forgot about multipolarity, and then we remembered again. So during the second 4 years of the Bush administration, people like me, who I was involved with U.S. Relations with Europe, were ordered every time we went to Europe. Of course, we're supposed to go and consult with NATO, but also visit the European Union. Visit the Commission, visit the Council, visit the Parliament. These are our allies. We cannot succeed in the world without them. Okay, good. So we got back on track. And then we had, well, we can characterize the Obama administration however we wish, but then we came to President Trump, and we had America first. And so that sounded a lot like we're going it alone again. And so the Hegelian, pendulum swung again to Joe Biden, President Biden, who's all about doing things together with our allies, right? NATO is really at the center of U.S. foreign policy. In the beginning, when it came to China, he was saying we can't succeed in altering Chinese behavior, especially on the trade front, the way we would like, without our allies. So we're stronger together. Okay, great. It seems like we're moving in that direction, but there's still the problem of Turkey, and I'm about to wrap up here. So the second part of this session is about Turkey playing a stabilizing role, and therefore, in a multipolar world, as one of those poles. Without question, Turkey has become a regional power. You could argue, it has been for a long time. It certainly was a great power in early Ottoman period. Anyway, Turkey is a highly influential, as Brenda was saying, not just military power, but a country that has tremendous soft power appeal, whether it be the TV serials, whether it be the organization of Turkic states. And Turkey is at a moment where it can realize the self-vision of Turkish foreign policy as being a stabilizing country. In Washington, when I've said that, as I was telling Yevgenia, when I try to make the point that this is what many Turkish foreign policy elites think their country is doing, stabilizing, quieting things down, I'm often attacked for being, I must be a paid agent for the Turkish government, because in Washington the view is the opposite on the same issues. So you're talking about Azerbaijan, the Karabakh War. Here, Turkey sees itself as having played a stabilizing role in restoring international law by helping Azerbaijan restore its territorial integrity and end the occupation of its lands. In Washington, I've had senior officials, even ones that were ambassadors in that region, blame Turkey for somehow persuading or pushing Azerbaijan to launch a war against Armenia. And if you argue that, no, that's not how it happened at all, and that the Armenian side, its leader had said, we're giving up the whole principle of lands for peace, and our new mantra is new wars for new territories, they still say, yeah, but Azerbaijan used force and Turkey encouraged them to. But from Turkey's perspective, Turkey has helped create the foundation for long-term stability. In the Eastern Mediterranean, from Turkey's perspective, it is striving to defend its rights and allow for an interpretation of international law when it comes to the definition of exclusive economic zones or maritime boundaries that involves not only debate, but the idea that, as is in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that neighboring countries on a coastline will inevitably have conflicts of interest and are therefore obligated to come up with ways to compromise that takes into account the interest of those neighboring states. If you listen to the debate in parts of Europe, that part is never said. What is said is that Turkey is belligerent, it has threatened to use force, and it's ignoring international law. Well, from Turkey's perspective, it's not ignoring international law, and it's trying to find a way now to calm things down, although it was quite aggressive in August of 2020, but now has kept its oil and gas exploration ships out of the Eastern Mediterranean. Or finally in Syria and in Libya, from the Turkish perspective, Turkey is the only country in the West or in NATO that actually used military force to stop Russian aggression and atrocities. First in Idlib, of course, in northwest Syria, and then in Libya against the Wagner group. But of course, in my home capital, those are seen as examples of Turkey launching military adventures. So I think this is the moment now, with the way Turkey has behaved in Ukraine, for Turkey to make its point. Okay, a lot of us would love Turkey to join the sanctions and maybe believe that the time was not yet right for Turkey to launch its mediation effort last March, because neither Zelensky nor Putin wanted a mediation. Maybe Zelensky did, but Putin certainly wanted to fight more. But the time will come. There will be a time when it is obvious that the Russian military is exhausted, Putin will have no choice but to sue for peace, and hopefully at that point, Ukraine will feel it's in a strong enough position, it's restored enough of its territorial integrity, to then turn to Turkey and say, okay, now's the time for mediation. But regardless of when or whether that happens, the grain deal, as you said, is really a great, not only diplomatic achievement of Turkey, but a humanitarian one because of all the lives that must have saved in the global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Sam, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for giving the opportunity to speak here today. I'll also try to be relatively brief. And let me just start by saying I'm so happy that the former ambassador was kind enough to mention the EU, because sometimes the EU is a bit forgotten. Unfortunately, this is a reality. The EU is, of course, a union of countries that have diverging interests, that don't always have the perfect strategic outlook towards the world, sometimes divided over certain things, whether it's Libya, whether it's Nagorno-Karabakh or other things. But the reality is that I happen to work there, so I have to deal with it. No, I mean, jokes aside, the reality is, of course, that the EU is a fundamental component, especially in economic and regulatory terms. And when we look at the greater continent, as the French would call it, or Eurasia, or however you wish to call it, Europe is a natural purchasing market, whether it's in energy terms or whether it's in goods or whether it's in rare earths and minerals and a whole range of other supply chain related areas which are very relevant. And so when we look at what's happened, I mean, just in the last few years, which has been a fundamental shift in geopolitics on so many different levels, starting with COVID, which made container prices, maritime container prices, fluctuate like we've rarely seen before, or go well beyond the $4,000 mark. All of a sudden, you then have a Ukraine war. The territorial integrity of Ukraine was unfortunately aggressed by Russia, and the repercussions which this has had for European ministries and also in terms of defense has been enormous. But I think most importantly, when we think about the relationship with Asia, it has also basically put Europe in a new position where they have to view the corridors between Europe and Asia in a different way. I mean, just a few weeks ago, President Mirziyoyev of Uzbekistan was in Paris, and 2 weeks before that, Tokayev was in Paris. And of course, it's no coincidence. Paris relies, or France relies enormously on uranium imports from Central Asia. The same thing applies when we think about, the transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, even though it's had a scale down since the war in Ukraine, but nonetheless, it's still high on the priority agenda. A lot of those renewable energy options come from elsewhere. They come from corridors towards the east, and they can no longer go through Russia because of sanctions, secondary sanction protests on the border with Poland, and a whole range of insurance issues and so forth. And as a result, Europe has to start look towards another part of the world, which it didn't used to. I mean, France very much looked towards Russia for a long time, and now has had to kind of look away from there. And when we take the most basic look at the geographical map, when we don't have maritime corridors, not that I'm trying to exclude them, they represent the majority of trade in the world, but in a decreasing fashion. And when we look at the new kind of regulatory frameworks, which the EU will implement in the next few years, it will also tax a lot and it will change price and so forth. But if we exclude maritime for a second, we just look at the land mass, it's very logical to see that if you can't pass through Russia, you can only pass through Turkey. Georgia, arguably, if you also go by sea and so forth. But that's basically what puts Turkey in such an essential position vis-a-vis new geopolitics, multipolarity, and arguably also as a stabilizing force for the European Union in terms of connectivity and markets. I think I'll stop there, but I'd be happy to talk more about that afterwards.
Thank you. Kadir.
Thank you, Kılıç. Thank you, my co-panelists. They've said most of what I wanted to say. Maybe I'll just repeat a couple points and then we'll turn to discussion. Thanks to also TRT World Forum for this very interesting and great meeting. So maybe piggybacking on some of the things that Matt said about, U.S. policy, I agree, Matt, that there's always some level of recognition about multipolarity, but how do you design foreign policy around that is a challenge. And it's not a unique challenge for the United States, only for many other countries. But I think we've seen important examples of that, especially with the Ukraine war, right? That when U.S. wanted to rally the allies and, craft a policy together, first of all, Washington went to certain actors in Europe. For instance, the coordination and policy making, through Turkey, with Turkey, was much less, I would say. It was much weaker, to be honest. Whereas Turkey was one of the countries that was most willing to be there and do things on the ground. That's just one example, right? When Biden administration came and wanted to rally the troops against Huawei, that worked to a large extent, but we saw a lot of voices coming out of Europe saying, we don't want a new Cold War, we don't want a trade war, etc. So coming to terms with the multipolarity and designing policy around that, especially when the crisis hits, because when the crisis hits, policymaking community tends to go back to basics, right? And you have to do that. Obviously, Russia is going for a conventional war, invasion, aggression against Ukrainian sovereignty, and that needed to be done for sure. But I think what Turkey was recognizing and was trying to do was to recognize that this would last a long time if we didn't, finish this early or wrap it up early, somehow find a solution as quickly as possible. And I agree, Putin was in no mood to probably make a deal anytime soon, but you keep trying. And that's the stabilizing force thing that comes in. And the examples are great you gave. When you look at Libya, Turkey literally prevented that country from going back into chaos. Are things great? Are being elections done? Is it a democracy? No, it's not going to happen anytime soon. But we have some sort of semblance of stability to build on. And you can extend that approach when you look at Turkish policy in Syria, in the Balkans, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the control. Some of the examples you guys gave, Azerbaijan and even Iran. Turkey seeks stability for a reason, right? It's not just the curse of the region, but it's also the Turkish national interest that, Turkey can thrive when there's stability because it does trade, it relies on some of the soft power issues, but it is also using its military power. And that has been the case, especially since the failed coup attempt in 2016. We've seen a much more willing Turkey to actually go in and do things on the ground. And then what Turkey recognized more and more over the years is that the ones who are on the ground, right, you have to deal with them. And that's how Turkey looks at Russia, Iran, and other forces. If you want to achieve some sort of stability on the ground, you need to be on the ground. Plus, you need to deal with the forces that are on the ground that matter. And, in the good old days of maybe Cold War or immediately afterwards, a lot of people pretended that the world was simpler than it was, right? So you kind of aligned with the Western policy and things were rather certain, like the uncertainty was removed from the picture. But that was never the case, probably, and that is absolutely not the case these days. So we are finding, I would say, the overarching theme of multipolarity. That's the challenge for all powers, including Turkey. How do you design policy in an era where you have constantly shifting interests, and then you have to deal with actors on the ground who are, bad actors, good actors, good and bad actors, and I think Turkey has been trying to do that for a while now. That's why that idea of, stabilizing a region, having some sort of stability so that we can build upon that. That's the idea for Turkish foreign policy, I think. But as I said, the United States, if it's working with the allies, it shouldn't be picking and choosing between allies, which are sort of more Washington-aligned allies versus guys we don't really like, but we have to deal with kind of approach. So in that sense, I think Washington needs to work more with Ankara.
Thank you very much. And in the second round, I will have some questions for our panelists. And it can be about your introductory remarks, but I have been in different panels with our panelists in the last 2-3 years. I may refer to those panels. In the first weeks of the war, Evgenia and me, we were in a panel, and at that time, the main focus when Ukraine-Turkey relations were in the agenda, it was about the drones. And since then now, Turkey did the grain deal, prisoner swap deal, and now there are rumors that they are working on fertilizer deal to provide artificial fertilizer for Asian countries. There are at least expectations in some of the Asian countries about Turkey playing this role. In addition to that, can Turkey play a role, diplomatic role, to end this war? And how do you see how it is possible? And what would be Ukrainian approach to that?
Thank you. Well, that's a 1 million lira question. Obviously, I don't have a very simple recipe to how to end this war, just because to end it in a diplomatic way, we first need to have at least two sides here that would be really willing to end this war, and unfortunately we still don't see that from the Russian side. And I think the preconditions are pretty clear. That's restoration of the territorial integrity of Ukraine going back to 1991, including Crimea, of course, and including all our territories. It's getting back our people who have been forcefully deported during these 10 months of war. Paying reparations, international tribunal for the war crimes which are happening in Ukraine. So it's clear that once Russia is ready for that, we would be happy, as I think Matt mentioned, right, to come back and say that, okay, so now we are ready to get back to the table, not to negotiate compromises on the territories of Ukraine, which are sovereign territories and which have been invaded and occupied by Russia, but to talk about the conditions of the peace. But second condition that we need to have is, again, basic principle of international law, which is, pactum sunt servanda, so agreements must be kept. And the problem that I have here is having the Russia that we have, can we actually trust the Russian side and sign that agreement? Because just to give you an example, we're talking a lot about the grain deal here. I come from Odessa. So when the grain deal was signed, with great efforts, personal efforts from the President Erdogan, in the United Nations as well, the next day, my city was attacked. Odessa seaport was attacked by Russian missiles. And then you have talks about diplomatic solution to the problem, and then at the same time, you have massive attacks on Ukraine with hundreds of Russian missiles coming and destroying our hospitals, schools, infrastructure, energy infrastructure. So in this regard, I don't see a place for diplomacy, meaning talking to an aggressor and trying to find a compromise with the aggressive Russia as it is, and with the occupied territories of Ukraine, which is a threat to Turkey. If you forget about Ukraine, let's think about the national security of Turkey and the region. If we have half of Ukraine occupied, that would be a Russian lake. And if we remember the history of the Russian-Turkish relations, we will understand this is one of the biggest threats, both in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea, for Turkey itself. So that's why I'm saying that this is kind of natural for us to be on the same side. Where I do see diplomatic role for Turkey is in security arrangements for the Black Sea region after this war ends. There is security compact, Kiev Security Compact, as it's called, is proposed by the Ukrainian side, what could be done by Ukraine and partners in the region. And we have to come and talk together on how do we, Turkey, Ukraine, here in the region, Romania, other NATO members, Georgia, how do we make it impossible for the Russian side to go on with its attacks against civilians in Ukraine and in other countries, including Moldova, Georgia, and others. So here, I think there is a huge role, a key role for Turkey to play diplomatically in thinking of the new mechanisms of deterring this aggression and making the price for any act of aggression as high that it would not be affordable for the Russian in the future.
Thank you very much. And Brenda, in the first weeks of the war, we were in a workshop together. And correct me if I was wrong, you had some concern that the fact that this comprehensive sanctions to Russia would have significant impact to global economy, and especially the energy sector. And since then, the energy issue and energy crisis become one of the hottest topics in international relations, especially in regards to Europe. and it was, I think, the week before last week, Economist cover shows that a frozen Europe, intimidating Europeans about this, and Russian media also circulating some videos threatening Europe about the winter. So tell us, you mentioned in the closing remarks, actually, closing part of it, that Turkey can play a role in energy security and a deal with Russia, maybe with Ukraine, about the energy issues. What kind of role Turkey can play here? If you want to provide a roadmap to Turkish authorities about the role that Turkey has to play about energy security, what would it entail?
Thank you. And wow, we have to be careful. You remember everything. It's a little tricky here. So first thing, in terms of the general energy crisis questions, I think it's very important to remember that Europe underwent two major energy crises prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we really have to remember that, because if we don't, and we think everything is about, okay, if we end the war, we end the occupation, then somehow the energy crisis will be solved, the food crisis will be solved. Wrong. There were two major crises, and what did we learn during these crises? One, when there isn't enough gas, what does Europe use? Coal and oil, not renewables. So drying up Europe from gas, this idea that, for about the last 10 years in Europe, let's don't commission more pipeline gas because then we'll create more room for renewables. All it did was create more room for coal. So if you get too extreme on your climate goals, you end up with a much less a worse performance on climate. Second, we have to remember also that the food crisis started before the invasion. For the same reasons, there were high natural gas prices in Europe, so many fertilizer factories closed down in Europe and in the UK, especially in Eastern Europe, because they couldn't be competitive with their high feedstock, and so that triggered already high prices. So the invasion exacerbated an already bad situation, but it didn't create that situation. Why was I concerned when we were in that meeting? It reminds me sort of the Bible story of Samson. So Samson's is very powerful, and he wants to take down his enemies, and his advisors say to him, hey, but Samson, if you take down the pillars on your enemies, you're going to be killed too. And it says in the Bible, Samson says, well, then let my soul die with the Philistines, right? So some way we're doing somewhat with these very ineffective, if we look right now, the oil cap just launched this week, completely ineffective. If at all, it maybe even serves Russia's interest because it makes buying Russian oil legitimate. It creates a mechanism. It actually makes Russian oil, in a sense, even more attractive. So, and even these ideas of capping gas prices and electricity prices in Europe, they're already starting to throw away, these elements. So we need to be not just ideological and say, that we're very excited, we're doing this, but things that actually could be effective. We need to watch. There's been a very serious oil drop price this week. People might not see that as a bad thing, right? Especially if you're a gasoline consumer, but it might be indicative of a complete economic crisis, meaning that the oil price might be dropping now. It shouldn't be dropping now just as the Russian oil cap is kicking into place. It might be dropping because we're having much deeper recession take place than we think. So we need to watch this. It might, again, before you had like the crash in 2009, you always have this very big drop in the oil price, and this could be an indication of things turning worse. In terms of your question, what would be on the list where Turkey could play a role? First thing, Turkey as a model. Turkey has a very diversified gas market with 6 different projects bringing in gas. The idea that pipeline gas, it's always cheaper than LNG. The prices are more reliable than LNG. So, how does Turkey should continue to play a role to shepherd in more pipeline gas into Europe. So this would be the expansion of the Southern Gas Corridor. This would be potentially bringing in gas from additional sources to the Southern Gas Corridor. And I think with the recent improvement in Turkish-Israeli relations, we can even talk now again about Eastern Mediterranean Israeli gas, through Turkey or to Turkey, but in a way bringing more volumes that could be, that could relieve Europe's crisis. Europe itself, if it really wants to solve its own crisis, it's not just about how much Turkey's willing willing to do, or Azerbaijan's willing to produce, or Israel to sell, but also Europe has to agree to long-term contracts. No one's going to invest in all this new gas and this new infrastructure if there isn't a committed buyer. And I think the question of public finance, which has become very geopolitical, so basically the West, the US, Europe, disengaged from all fossil fuel funding, which includes natural gas. And so in the end, it just leaves it here. We throw it to China, just do, you should fund all these projects around the world, and we're giving a complete geopolitical goal to a gift to China, which won't change anything in terms of how much gas it's used, but it will give China a tremendous benefit. Thank you.
Just to follow up that, do you expect any scenario in which the countries in Eastern Mediterranean can reconcile their differences and establish a new project, actually, that will involve Turkey?
I mean, I think we should see, first thing is energy. It's important for Turkey to be a part of any discussions on energy. I think it was really, it was sort of counterproductive. Well, not sort of. It was counterproductive that, if you have regional fora, the whole idea is actually to have an opportunity for countries that have some disagreements and conflicts to maybe work on bilateral cooperation. So when there was like these Eastern Mediterranean gas fora that didn't include Turkey, I think this was counterproductive. So certainly any meetings, discussions regionally should include Turkey. Some really interesting things are happening. Essentially, it's Egyptian gas, but potentially Israeli molecules are even going into Syria, Lebanon. This is even quite close to Turkey. Definitely exploration and developments are increasing in Egypt. I think a lot of things are happening in the region, and yes, it would be great for Turkey at least to be a part of the dialogue. Companies will decide if this should be, if there should actually be export, through or to Turkey, but definitely should be part of the process.
Thank you very much. And Matt, we were in the same panel in TRT World Forum when we met last time in person here, and 2019 was probably one of the worst years in Turkish-American relations. And the points that you made in 2009, more or less similar to what you said today. Should we continue to be pessimistic about the Turkish-American relations because of unpredictability, let's say, not inconsistency maybe, but unpredictability in US foreign policy?
Yeah, I think we should be pessimistic, because there's such a disconnect still between the basic narratives in Turkey versus the United States. I mean, we should keep in mind in the United States, I don't know if this is an optimistic or a pessimistic point, but in the US, I mean, Turkey's not a mainstream topic for foreign policy, right, or for foreign policy experts. Specialists like us here focus on Turkey, and that's not to say that that's smart. I mean, Turkey is hugely significant strategically, geostrategically, geoeconomically. But the narrative gets simplified in Washington along the lines of what I was talking about before with the stereotypes or misunderstanding of what Turkey believes its role and what its activities are doing and accomplishing. So because there's that disconnect, I worry it's really difficult to get back on track, but I think we're in a much better place than we were in 2019. But just to put it in perspective, maybe two points, just that's off the top of my head. One is, when it comes to, let's say, the PKK, YPG, in the United States, there's a complete lack of understanding that the YPG, or the PYD, represents not the Kurds of Syria, it represents, it's a Marxist, Leninist, radical organization that does not enjoy majority support, put it that way, in northern Syria. In Washington, of course, the narrative is that the Turkey is killing the Kurds writ large. So that's a big disconnect. And I hope someday there'll be a point where both in Washington, but also here, if we go back to the points about Ukraine, that there could be an understanding that sometimes neutrality and trying to just to be pragmatic really isn't so helpful if you think about the situation from the other actor's point of view. What do I mean? I completely agree that, by the way, the sooner this war ends, the better. And as I was saying in my remarks, there will be a time when it is right for Turkey to mediate, and it will be so welcome, just like on the grain deal. But if you're sitting here, think about somebody telling you that, well, okay, in Turkey's southeast, there are terrorist organizations, and really, it would be much better if you made peace, Turkey, with them, and didn't use military force, certainly not in northern Iraq or in Syria or elsewhere. To me, just saying that, I feel outraged. I mean, of course Turkey has a right to defend itself and fight terrorism and defend its, and restore, or well, protect its territorial integrity. Therefore, so does Ukraine, without any question. So Ukraine should not be pressured to stop fighting now to restore its territorial integrity. Don't be frightened by Putin's fake bluffs of nuclear war, which is never going to happen because he's not going to get attacked. But do then recognize that Turkey is totally legitimate when it fights to protect its territorial integrity and fight terrorism. So that's one big disconnect that makes me pessimistic. Hopefully the F-16 deal will get on track and will provide some background noise that will improve the relationship, though our friend Colonel Lutzen was telling me just now he's not so optimistic that that's going to happen. So the other big disconnect goes back to the coup attempt, which is kind of, to me, the craziest one. I think a lot of people in Washington are convinced that Turkey engineered the coup attempt, and they in Washington, a lot of people, I think, probably wanted it to succeed. And even one of my business partners, I've said this before, I think I did in 2019, he said to me on the Monday after the coup attempt, when everyone was talking about, wow, did the US actually foment it? He said, but where were you, though, on Saturday night? And he was honest. He wasn't trying to be funny. And so there's a misperception in the US that somehow the government here wanted this coup attempt to happen, and they wanted to use it for political gain. And then here there's a belief that the US is the one that engineered the coup attempt, with Fethullah Gülen living in Pennsylvania. And how could it be that the organization that organized and implemented the coup attempt, whose leader lives in Pennsylvania, means the US had nothing to do with it? And of course, President Putin, what we know, was helping people here in Turkey believe that, of course, the US planned it. So when you've still got such fundamental misalignments, it's very difficult to be optimistic, even though I think everyone here in this room recognizes it should be different, and that the US will be way better if the US tries to understand the world from Turkey's perspective. But just as Yevgenia was saying, Turkey will be way better if Turkey understands what Putin is doing in the Black Sea, first to Georgia, now twice to Ukraine, as a huge threat to Turkey's national security, but to all of our security. And if had, God forbid, Putin succeeded, whether it be in Kyiv or with the land bridge offensive, gone through your city, Yevgenia, and taken Odessa, Moldova was next. I have plenty of friends in Moldova who were vigorously trying to find out how to get US visas because they wanted to get their families out. And if that happened, he's going to go back into Georgia again, and if that happened, watch out Baltic states. So he has to be stopped now. But I'm a little bit off the beaten path here.
Tell me why
pessimistic.
should we be optimistic? You said
Because of the underlying thank you, Kilic. The underlying reality that Turkey is so significant in so many ways. Huge, diversified industrial base, right? 84 million people. Geographic location. Borders that are a gigantic threat to Turkey, with countries that are creating problems for everyone. But still then a NATO ally with NATO's second largest military that is wanting to join the European Union, at least rhetorically, and is a critical contributor to NATO security. So Turkey's inherent importance is evident. Turkey as a transportation route for the East-West corridor or the Southern corridor for natural gas is obvious. I just hope, as a little aside, that Turkey and Azerbaijan will come to an agreement on the terms of transiting natural gas across Turkey, so that then Turkey really does become the proverbial natural gas hub that it so long has wanted to be.
Thank you very much. Before Sam, I want to go back to Evgenia and ask the Black Sea one more time, because there was a strong emphasis from Matt about Black Sea, and you also mentioned in your introductory remarks that Black Sea security is so important that Turkey and Ukraine can play a role in that. What do you mean about that, and what do you foresee about the future of Black Sea?
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for going back to that. I think this is a perfect moment for Turkey to generally reconsider its role in the Black Sea region and its relations with Russia in a way that, you know, there have been, everyone is frank today, right? So I will also be frank today saying that I lived in Turkey for 5 years, and I know all these talks about great Russia, about Russia being the second biggest army in the world, and about all those historical traumas, unfortunately, that come back from history and are still felt today very often in Turkey's strategic culture and collective memory. I think this is a time to sit and think, look, Ukrainians are small. We're a great nation. I'm proud of my nation, but we are small as a country if you compare it to Russia, right? It's 140 million and we are something like a bit more than 40 million. We are not a NATO member and we basically almost do not have fleet. So, of course, with the help and support of our international partners, but still it's Ukraine who has been fighting, effectively and efficiently fighting against Russians now for 10 months. So this shows us that very often, whatever Russia is talking about, as Matt mentioned, nuclear arguments, all this bluff about being huge power, huge military power, huge economic power, it's basically an illusion, which has been very much fed from these, historical victories in Russian Ottoman wars, but which is no more the case, because Russia now is not a Russian empire of the past. Russia now is not a Soviet Union. That's another example. I have to remind here that Soviet Union was 15 republics, including Ukraine, which is doing pretty well now. So I think it's a use it or lose it moment when generally Russia has to be treated as a normal state in the region, not with the special status, not with the unique military or whatever status in the region, just as a normal country which has to abide by the rules. So we're talking about rules-based world order. And here, coming to your question, what Turkey and Ukraine can do is actually to cooperate more on, for example, investing in our defense industries, in our capacities. You know that Turkey is now also building warship for Ukraine, which is another thing which we appreciate and has not been mentioned so far. We still have plans to build a Bayraktar plant in Ukraine, and that has not been cancelled even after the war started, invasion started. We do have space technologies, we have aviation technologies here, and we are ready to cooperate. But that will be cooperation which is based on a positive agenda, not to attack anyone, not to go into war with anyone, but actually to be sure that if we cooperate, as Turkey and Ukraine, for example, we can, and with Romania, we can have patrols in the Black Sea region. We can have, our warships just not to let the Russian warships to come and mess up the region. If we want to have energy security, we can think on how we can cooperate together on decoupling from Russian gas, which Turkey is now trying to do, and Europe is also trying to do, and how we can diversify that. So there are many different dimensions to talk about, but the main idea here, the main remark here is that Russia does not have any specific rights or any legitimate rights, I would say, to control the territories in the region, just as no other country has. So for that reason, starting from this change of mentality, change of strategic culture, change of mindset, and just seeing Russia as a normal state, not saying that we do not have a luxury of not cooperating with Russia. Of course, if it's in our interest, we will cooperate maybe 25, 30 years from now, I don't know. So it's not about just isolating Russia for the purpose of isolating Russia, it's just for bringing back the rules-based world order, which will both be in Turkey's and in Ukraine's interest.
Thank you very much. And Sam, Matt brought EU to this debate, and I will bring the NATO back to this debate. Sam and we were in a panel in June 2021, actually. It was the NATO concept meeting, and we had a panel. And in that conversation, we didn't talk much about Russia, right? It was about China, that it would take place in NATO's 2030 concept paper, and there was other issues like race in technology, and some meetings. There was a meeting between Biden and Putin before that, as far as I remember. But we didn't talk about Russia. So all of those conversations now talking about Ukraine, Russia, where is NATO here, and what should be NATO's role?
I mean, we didn't talk much about Russia, but I ended up writing a lot about it afterwards because of everything that happened. I think, I mean, when we look at, especially from the EU's perspective, when we look at NATO, it's of course important to remember that not every single EU country is a NATO country. So there's already some diverging differences with regards to this. But I think what's clear to everyone is that since the invasion of Ukraine, there's been a gigantic need for securitization of Europe, something which the European Union was, despite some of its members' probable desire to do it independently, were not capable of doing. And as a result, the relationship with the US, which is of course the relationship with NATO, was vital. And I think the more and more we see the continuation of this war, we also realize that this also applies to some degree for Turkey, it applies for most of the European Union. And in order to, let's say, counter the, the aggression which we've witnessed from Russia in the past year, there is a need for a transatlantic relationship which has to be tightened and deepened. The problem, of course, becomes, I mean, since we're all being very frank here, the problem, of course, becomes that for anyone who studies and looks at the EU, especially when it comes to defense, is aware of the fact that there's been a very, very large policy and an ongoing desire to create a degree of strategic autonomy, led in part by France, in large part by France, one can argue. And as a result, this has created some friction now. I mean, there's something called the Strategic Compass, which came out right before the invasion of Ukraine. And a lot of that has kind of created a little bit of a headache in some capitals with regards to this strategic autonomy. So I think, to answer your question specifically, it's clear that the EU needs to engage maximum with NATO, but some of the frictions when it comes to patents, technology, and of course, I mean, the tech chamber with Margrethe Vestager, these kind of areas which we, even in the last few weeks, see some frictions on, really have to be overcome in order to be able to cement that relationship to its fullest extent. Because if one doesn't cement the US-EU relationship, and if countries like France, for example, doesn't see eye to eye on all these areas, the real danger becomes that NATO allies, including Turkey, won't be able to take advantage of protecting oneself in light of the Russian aggression, which we're seeing, as was mentioned before, not only in Idlib, but also in Libya, and for example, in the region that I deal with a lot, which is Central Asia, a region where Russian disinformation is rampant, a region where Russian business ties and also other forms of informal ties are very deep, and a region where we're now seeing countries like, for example, Kazakhstan make arguably never seen before foreign policy moves in terms of independence. And so in order to be able to support countries that deserve independence and that wish to have an independent foreign policy and that don't wish to be, you know, kind of nostalgic spheres of influence of the Soviet Union, as was mentioned before, in order to allow for those kind of things, which I think the EU is very keen on, that kind of NATO relationship is key.
And finally, Kadir, your opinions about the future of Turkish foreign policy now, about the Middle East, because there has been recent changes, and we spend a lot of time talking about Black Sea and the war in Ukraine. But how about the Middle East, the changes that we are seeing in Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East? What do you see the future of this change and transformation?
This will actually help the earlier conversation. I think there could be a misperception about Turkey's dealings with Russia. One, I don't think Turkey overestimates Russia. Turkey has has pushed back against Russian interests in a number of conflict zones on the ground, including Libya, Syria, Caucasus. So when Turkey tries to talk to Russia, it's not from a position of weakness. It is actually from a position of trying to ensure and help Ukrainians as well. I mean, while Erdogan was trying to engage Putin, he was supplying all the military help, logistical help, a lot of stuff reported, but probably a lot of stuff not reported, and help facilitate NATO help as well. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration when Turkey's policy is presented as like, oh, everybody's trying to take a stance against Russia, but Turkey is not. So that's not true. Turkey did that in the Middle East. Turkey did that in Ukraine. And my only complaint was, if we're going to have this broad policy to sort of stop Russia somehow as NATO, that needs to be a much more robust process. And while all the military help that's going into Ukraine is completely legitimate, they need to self-defend themselves. It also needs to be coupled with a broader strategy, diplomatic strategy. I think that's what I was trying to emphasize. And then Turkey in the Middle East, Kılıç, in your question, right? We are really feeling that multipolarity thing, right? All the headlines past couple days in U.S. newspapers is about MBS meeting Xi. That's only, 1 or 2 months after Biden fist bumped MBS in Saudi Arabia. So that is multipolarity, right? These regional powers, MBS, Israel, right? When you look at Israel's relation with Russia, when you look at Turkey's relations, when you look at the shifts that Turkey is trying to, engineer with Egypt, and even potentially, down the road, Assad, if it's useful on the ground, etc. All these outreach efforts, I think, is a regional reflection of that multipolarity on the region. So these actors will, going forward, no longer wait for some sort of overarching policy agenda from Washington or from Brussels, but they are now dealing with each other. And when you look at, only 3-4 years ago, Qatar was put under a, severe situation by its Gulf neighbors, and look at the picture today. And Turkey was there. Turkey was the stabilizing factor there. So when you look at Turkey's policy in the Middle East, you're seeing both of these things, right? Both a strong recognition of multipolarity, having to deal with these actors you may not necessarily agree with. Also, your interests directly run counter their interests. In Libya, right? The Russian aligned forces were pushed aside by pro-Turkish forces. Same thing in Syria. So multipolarity is partly guiding Turkish policy, but also that effort to help bring stability. We are seeing that in the refugee issues. We are seeing, when you talk about the French, right, just a couple of years ago, they took a very anti-Turkey line in the Eastern Mediterranean issues, gas and energy issues, but Turkey didn't hesitate to join that, broader political conversation. Yeah, so Turkey is very also practical, and whatever is going to help bring stability and somehow lead to peace. But that doesn't mean Turkey is dropping the, ball on the, the Ukrainian sovereignty, or helping allies, or, preventing refugee situation from getting larger. So I think these two aspects need to be thought together when you're looking at Turkey's foreign policy towards the Middle East, but also towards its allies within NATO or outside NATO.
Sam, I have to ask this question. Everybody, when they are talking about multipolarity, they talk about China, Russia, and United States. Do you think EU is part of that, one of those poles? And does the EU feel itself one of those poles in this transforming world?
Easy questions you're asking. Now, I mean, first of all, my own personal opinion about the question of multipolarity. I mean, I'm of the personal opinion, just like Kenneth Walsh, that multipolarity doesn't last. Other academics believe that there can be a degree of stability with that.
But they say the same thing for unipolarity as well.
Sure,
Right?
I also agree with that. I don't think that unipolarity will last that long either. I think that inevitably the structure of bipolarity is where it ends and where it stays for a consistent amount of time. So, but that's not to say that multipolarity won't last a certain amount of time, or it depends very much on the context of the moment, of course, and one has to take into account all the variables. One can't just rely on an academic ivory tower theory in order to proclaim these things. But just coming to your point about Turkey's role within, or sorry, EU's role within that context, and then I'll come to Turkey. The EU on its own cannot be considered a pole in terms of security, military, and so forth. Not because it doesn't have the capability of doing it in the future, but if you actually realistically look at what it has in terms of to fulfill the objective or criteria definition of being a pole, it doesn't have those requirements at the moment. It has, as I mentioned before, a very, very strong regulatory framework. I mean, just think about the impact that GDPR or Digital Services Act will have on many other parts of the world. Undoubtedly, it has that degree of weight. But when it comes to what, at least when one speaks about polarity, security aspects, when one talks about security aspects, it does not have that. I mean, when we look at, for example, the CSDP missions of the EU, since the early 2000s, starting with the Bosnia-Herzegovina one, inherited by NATO, by the way. I mean, and then there are approximately 30, I think 38 until now, the latest one being in Mozambique. I mean, about half of them are civilian. Most of them are monitoring missions, like the one in Georgia. And the EU is taking baby steps vis-a-vis actually having, military training and everything that goes with that. So I think there's a potential in the future, if multipolarity were to last, but I personally don't think it will, then of course there's a potential for that in the future. But I think to speed up that process, if one were to think that there should be a stronger pole in this part of the world, then the logical outcome would be EU-Turkey, because together there's a potential for polarity there.